She walked to the corner store for a bottle of soda on a warm summer evening. She never came home, and for 3 decades, the people who knew the truth remained silent, until a small device inside a metal safe started beeping, revealing secrets buried for a generation. If you believe every disappearance deserves answers, subscribe to this channel. It helps us give voice to those who were silenced. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population 8,700. A town where railroad tracks cut through the center like a scar, dividing the modest working-class homes from the more affluent neighborhoods. A place where everyone claimed to know everyone, yet secrets somehow managed to stay buried. In the summer of 1987, when VHS rentals and mall food courts were the weekend highlights for teenagers, 17-year-old Eliza Chambers became one of the nearly 800,000 people reported missing in America that year. But unlike most cases, where children are found within hours or days, Eliza's disappearance would stretch into years, then decades, leaving behind nothing but fading missing person flyers and a family gradually disintegrating under the weight of not knowing. This is not simply a story about a missing girl. This is a story about how one town collectively looked away, about how memories can be as unreliable as they are precious, about how technology, even when primitive by today's standards, sometimes refuses to let the truth remain buried. In small towns like Millbrook, mysteries don't just vanish. They simmer beneath the surface, occasionally bubbling up in whispered conversations at the local diner or in the nervous glances exchanged at high school reunions. For 30 years, Eliza's case was the ghost story nobody wanted to fully acknowledge. Until 2017, when an electronic beacon, one that should have stopped working decades earlier, began signaling from inside the darkness of a pawnshop safe, triggering a chain of revelations that would finally bring light to the shadows. Eliza Ann Chambers, 17 years old when she disappeared on June 12, 1987, 5'4" with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, according to her mother. A junior at Millbrook High with plans to study photography at community college the following year. Her bedroom, preserved like a time capsule by her grief-stricken parents, told the story of a typical teenager of the era. Madonna and the Cure posters on lavender walls, a bookshelf lined with Stephen King novels and photography magazines, a bulletin board covered with Polaroids of friends making silly faces at the camera. Teachers described Eliza as quiet but not shy, the kind of student who didn't raise her hand often, but always had thoughtful answers when called upon. Her guidance counselor noted that while her grades weren't exceptional, she had a natural eye for composition that made her photography stand out. Her black and white portraits of elderly residents at the local nursing home had won a regional contest earlier that year. Friends remembered Eliza as loyal, but sometimes distant. She kept parts of herself hidden, said Melanie Winters, her best friend since 4th grade, like she was always halfway somewhere else in her mind. What stood out most about Eliza was her unusual bracelet, a gift from her grandfather who worked in electronics. It wasn't much to look at, a thin silver band with a small rectangular attachment that held a rudimentary tracking device, a prototype he'd been developing for his company. In case you ever get lost, he'd told her, though the range was limited to just a few miles, and the battery was only expected to last a few years at most. Eliza wore it constantly, more for sentimental value than practical use. The irony that someone wearing a tracking device could vanish so completely wasn't lost on investigators. But in 1987, before cell phones and GPS, before cameras on every street corner, disappearing was still terrifyingly possible. And in Eliza's case, it seemed almost as if she had simply evaporated into the humid summer air. Friday, June 12, 1987 began as unremarkably as any other summer day. The temperature hit 83 degrees by noon. Millbrook High had released students for summer break just 1 week earlier. Eliza had spent the morning helping her mother plant tomatoes in their small backyard garden. Around 6:30 p.m., Eliza mentioned she was walking to Donna's corner store, a 5-minute walk from her house. She wanted a cherry cola and the latest issue of Rolling Stone magazine. Her mother, Diana Chambers, was preparing dinner and barely looked up when Eliza called out that she'd be right back. "Wear your jacket," Diana called after her. "They're saying it might rain later." Security footage from Donna's, grainy and black and white, showed Eliza entering the store at 6:42 p.m. She browsed the magazine rack, selected a Rolling Stone with U2 on the cover, and purchased it along with a cherry cola and a pack of juicy fruit gum. The cashier, 68-year-old Walter Donner, remembered nothing unusual about their interaction. Eliza left the store at 6:51 p.m. The 5-minute walk home should have put Eliza back in her kitchen by 7 p.m. But the chicken casserole Diana had prepared grew cold as the minutes ticked by. At 7:30, she called Melanie's house. By 8:15, she'd called all of Eliza's friends. By 9 p.m., Diana and her husband Thomas were driving the streets of Millbrook, calling their daughter's name into the darkness. By midnight, the first police report had been filed. The last confirmed sighting of Eliza came from Marianne Decker, who lived 3 blocks from the Chambers home. From her front porch, Marianne saw Eliza walking home, sipping her cherry cola. She noticed a blue sedan slow down beside Eliza. She couldn't make out the driver's face or the license plate in the fading light. When questioned further, Marianne couldn't even be certain if Eliza had spoken to the driver or if the car had stopped completely. It was getting dark, she told police, and then it started to rain. That rain washed away whatever physical evidence might have been left behind: footprints, tire tracks, the cherry cola bottle Eliza had been carrying, all gone by morning. The only trace of Eliza Chambers was a damp Rolling Stone magazine found in the gutter 2 blocks from home, its pages swollen with rainwater, U2's faces distorted like melting wax figures. The morning after Eliza disappeared, the Chambers' modest split-level home transformed into the epicenter of a growing storm. Diana sat rigid at the kitchen table, mechanically dialing and redialing Eliza's friends, while Thomas paced between rooms, his hands trembling as he handed out school photos of his daughter to the officers who filled their living room. "She wouldn't run away," Diana insisted to Detective Marcus Reynolds, the lead investigator assigned to the case. "She has a photography internship starting Monday. She's been talking about it for weeks." The first 24 hours were a blur of police questions, neighbor interviews, and rising panic. By the second day, local news crews parked on their street. By the third day, volunteers gathered in the high school gymnasium, organizing search parties that would comb through the woods behind Millbrook Park, the abandoned rail yard, and the shoreline of Lake Millbrook. Eliza's younger brother, Danny, just 13 at the time, watched from the stairs as strangers moved through his home, pinning maps to walls and speaking in hushed tones. "I kept thinking she was going to walk through the front door and be annoyed that all these people were touching her stuff," he recalled years later. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Millbrook had not seen a missing person case in over a decade, and never involving a teenager. Church groups organized prayer vigils. Local businesses printed flyers with Eliza's photo. The high school postponed its summer maintenance to serve as a command center for the search effort. But as days stretched into weeks, the initial surge of support began to ebb. The news crews packed up their vans. The volunteers dwindled to a handful of family friends. The police visits became less frequent. And with each passing day, the weight of absence pressed heavier on the Chambers family. Diana stopped cooking meals, surviving on coffee and whatever casseroles neighbors continued to drop off. Thomas took a leave of absence from his job at the paper mill, spending his days driving increasingly wider circles around town, scanning faces in neighboring counties. Danny stopped leaving the house entirely, convinced that if he wasn't home when Eliza returned, she might leave again. By the 1-month mark, the absence of leads had created a vacuum that began to fill with speculation. Whispers about family troubles, questions about Eliza's friends, rumors about Thomas's temper. In small towns, when answers aren't forthcoming, people create their own. As summer faded into fall, certain behaviors around town began to draw the attention of Detective Reynolds. Small things that, when viewed individually, might seem insignificant. But together, they formed a pattern that suggested not everyone in Millbrook was as bewildered by Eliza's disappearance as they claimed. Principal among these was the sudden resignation of Gregory Weston, Eliza's photography teacher, just 2 weeks after she vanished. The 32-year-old had accepted a position at a private school in Oregon, a decision he claimed had been months in the making, though no one at Millbrook High had heard him mention it before. He was acting strange that whole last week of school, remembered the school secretary, Margaret Dolan, cleaning out his darkroom at odd hours. Jumpy whenever anyone came into his classroom. When interviewed by police before his departure, Weston provided little insight, saying only that Eliza was a promising student who kept to herself. He had been the one to arrange her summer internship at the local newspaper. Phone records would later show he made 3 calls to the Chambers household in the month before Eliza disappeared, all when Diana and Thomas were at work. When questioned about these calls, he claimed they were regarding the internship details. Then there was Carl Henning, owner of Millbrook Pawn and Loan, whose behavior shifted noticeably after Eliza vanished. The normally gregarious businessman became withdrawn, closing his shop for days at a time with no explanation. His wife reported that he began drinking heavily and installed an elaborate security system for the small pawn shop, a seemingly excessive measure for a business in low-crime Millbrook. Most puzzling was the behavior of Eliza's best friend, Melanie Winters. Initially distraught and at the forefront of search efforts, Melanie abruptly stopped participating after the 3rd week. She avoided the Chambers family entirely and transferred to a different high school that fall. When approached by Detective Reynolds for follow-up questions, Melanie's parents intercepted, saying their daughter was too traumatized to discuss Eliza further. Diana Chambers noticed these strange behaviors too. "It's like parts of Eliza's life were being erased," she told Reynolds during their weekly check-ins. "People who should be helping us find her are instead trying to forget she ever existed." The detective noted these concerns in his growing case file, but lacked enough concrete evidence to pursue any of these individuals more aggressively. Without a body, without witnesses, without any clear evidence of foul play, the case remained officially classified as a missing person, not a homicide investigation. But Reynolds kept a separate notebook, one he didn't share with his department. In it, he mapped connections between these individuals, Weston, Henning, Melanie, searching for the invisible threads that might link them to the last person who saw Eliza alive. 8 months after Eliza's disappearance, on a frigid February morning in 1988, a county road crew clearing drainage ditches after a heavy snowmelt made a discovery that briefly reignited the investigation. In a culvert, about 12 miles outside of Millbrook, a worker found a waterlogged backpack wedged against a grate. Inside the muddy bag were items that Diana Chambers immediately identified as her daughter's: a denim jacket with embroidered flowers on the collar, a Walkman with a mixtape still inside, and a partially destroyed notebook containing what appeared to be poetry. The backpack itself was not Eliza's. She had been carrying no bag the evening she disappeared, but the contents undeniably belonged to her. The discovery presented more questions than answers. How had Eliza's possessions ended up in this remote location? Why were they in an unfamiliar backpack? And why these specific items, things she hadn't been carrying when she left for the corner store? Forensic analysis revealed little. Water damage had destroyed any fingerprints or trace evidence. The backpack was a common JanSport model sold in thousands of stores nationwide. The location, while isolated, was adjacent to a highway frequented by long-haul truckers and travelers passing through to the interstate. The mixtape provided one tangible clue. Carefully dried and analyzed, it contained songs recorded from the radio, with a DJ's voice occasionally cutting in between tracks. The radio station, WKRL, served a broadcasting area that included parts of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio. More significantly, one segment captured the DJ announcing the date of the recording, May 30th, 1987, just 2 weeks before Eliza disappeared. The notebook proved more perplexing. What initially appeared to be poetry was actually a coded journal. Eliza had developed a simple substitution cipher, replacing letters with symbols. Detective Reynolds, working with a cryptography expert from the state police, managed to decode portions of the text. What emerged were fragmented entries that hinted at a secret Eliza had been keeping. He says we need to be careful. People wouldn't understand. 2 more weeks and none of it will matter anymore. And later, Grandpa's gift might be the answer. If things go wrong, it could lead them to me. The last decoded entry, dated June 10th, 1987, just 2 days before her disappearance, read simply, "I'm scared, but there's no other way out." The discovery of the backpack transformed the investigation. What had been treated as a possible runaway case or random abduction now showed signs of premeditation and Eliza's own awareness of impending danger. But despite renewed search efforts and interviews, the momentum faded again as winter turned to spring with no further breakthroughs. The backpack and its contents joined the other evidence in the case file, tantalizing fragments of a story without an ending. And Eliza's cryptic reference to her grandfather's gift, the tracking bracelet, seemed like cruel irony. Whatever signal it might have once emitted had long since gone silent. Or so everyone believed. As 1988 gave way to 1989, and then to the early 1990s, Eliza Chambers became less a person and more a local legend. Her face on missing posters weathered and faded. The annual vigils drew fewer attendees each year. The dedicated phone line at the police station that once rang constantly now sat silent for weeks at a time. For the Chambers family, time did not heal, but rather calcified their wounds into something permanent and unchanging. Diana and Thomas divorced in 1991, the strain of their shared grief proving too heavy for their marriage to bear. Thomas moved to Ohio, remarried, and had another daughter, choices that Diana interpreted as betrayal, as if he were trying to replace the family that had been broken. Diana remained in the same house, preserving Eliza's room exactly as she'd left it that June evening. Danny, unable to escape his sister's ghost, left for college in California and rarely returned home. When interviewed for a 10-year retrospective piece in the local newspaper, he admitted, "I have 2 lives, the one before she disappeared, which I can barely remember, and everything after, which never feels quite real." Detective Reynolds retired in 1999, handing the case file to a younger officer who placed it among the department's cold cases, a bureaucratic acknowledgement of defeat. Before clearing out his desk, Reynolds visited Diana one last time. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring her home to you," he told her, the weight of his failure visible in the slump of his shoulders. "She's not dead," Diana replied, with the certainty of someone who had made faith a replacement for fact. "I would know if she was. A mother would know." The new millennium brought new forensic technologies, advanced DNA testing, improved database systems, facial recognition software. But these tools required physical evidence, witnesses or fresh leads, none of which existed in Eliza's case. Occasionally, remains discovered in other parts of the state would prompt a flurry of activity, but DNA comparisons always ruled out a connection to Eliza. By 2007, 20 years after the disappearance, even Diana's certainty had begun to waver. On the anniversary that year, she finally allowed a small memorial service at the local church. Not a funeral, she insisted, but an acknowledgement that whatever had happened to Eliza, she was no longer the 17-year-old girl who had walked out the door that summer evening. She would be 37 now, possibly with a family of her own. "If she's out there, I hope she knows I never stopped looking," Diana told the small gathering. "And if she's not, I hope she found peace." The case had grown so cold that when Carl Henning died of a heart attack in his pawn shop in 2010, no one connected it to Eliza's disappearance, despite his name appearing in Reynolds' notes as a person of interest. His widow sold the business to their nephew, Jason Henning, who modernized the store but kept its essential character intact, including the massive floor safe in the back office that had been installed in the late 1980s. In small towns, memories are long but selective. By 2017, 3 decades after Eliza vanished, most residents of Millbrook would say they remembered the case, if asked directly. But it had been years since anyone had spontaneously mentioned her name in the present tense, until the safe began to beep. April 3rd, 2017. Jason Henning was conducting his annual inventory at Millbrook Pawn and Loan when he first heard it, a faint, rhythmic electronic pulse coming from inside the floor safe in the back office. The sound was so subtle that at first he thought it was his cell phone vibrating or perhaps the battery warning on the carbon monoxide detector. But as he moved closer to the safe, the sound became unmistakable, a distinct beeping pattern, 3 short pulses followed by a pause, repeating every 30 seconds or so. The safe, a massive Mosler from the 1970s that Jason had never fully emptied since inheriting the business, contained hundreds of items that had either been abandoned by customers or acquired by his uncle over decades of operation. "It was the weirdest thing," Jason later told reporters. "Electronic items in pawn shops are a dime a dozen, but nothing should be active inside a sealed safe, and definitely nothing with a battery that could last that long." Curious, but not yet concerned, Jason began the laborious process of emptying the safe to locate the source of the beeping. It took him nearly 2 days to sort through the contents. Old watches, jewelry, cameras, musical instruments, and various electronic devices from different eras. The beeping continued, seeming to grow more insistent as he neared the bottom layers. Finally, in a small leather pouch tucked into a corner of the safe, Jason found it, a tarnished silver bracelet with a rectangular attachment. As soon as he lifted it, he recognized what it was, or at least what it resembled. In his years running the pawn shop, he'd seen the evolution of personal tracking devices, from the bulky early models to the sleek modern versions. This was clearly an early prototype, but it was remarkably sophisticated for its age. And somehow, impossibly, it was still functioning after what must have been decades inside the safe. Jason might have simply disposed of the bracelet as an obsolete curiosity, if not for one critical detail. Etched on the inside band was a name, Eliza C. Even having grown up after her disappearance, Jason knew the name. Everyone in Millbrook did. He immediately called the police. Officer Samantha Cruz, who had inherited Eliza's case file just 2 years earlier during a departmental reorganization, arrived within minutes. Though skeptical at first, batteries simply didn't last 30 years, her demeanor changed the moment she saw the bracelet. It matched the description in the original missing person report, right down to the unique rectangular tracking module. "This doesn't make sense," Cruz said, carefully placing the still beeping bracelet into an evidence bag. "This thing should have died decades ago, and why start beeping now, after all this time?" The answer came from Dr. Howard Chambers, Eliza's grandfather, now 91, and living in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. Though his memory had faded on many fronts, he recalled with perfect clarity the bracelet he had given his granddaughter. "It wasn't just any tracker," he explained, his voice quavering with age and emotion. "It was a prototype I was developing for search and rescue operations. The main battery was standard, would have died years ago. But there was a secondary power source, an experimental long-life battery connected to a dormant circuit. It was designed to activate only when the primary system failed, and the device detected it was in motion after a long period of stillness. In other words, the bracelet had been deliberately designed to wake up. if it was moved after being stationary for years. Exactly what had happened when Jason began emptying the safe during his inventory. Dr. Chambers touched the evidence bag containing his creation, his eyes filling with tears. I never thought I designed it to find lost hikers weeks or months after they disappeared. Not my own granddaughter 30 years later. The implications were staggering. The bracelet had been in Carl Henning's safe since shortly after Eliza vanished. And now, suddenly, the pawn shop owner's strange behavior following her disappearance took on a far more sinister dimension. But Carl was long dead, and with him, potentially, the truth about what had happened to Eliza. The bracelet offered proof of his involvement, but no explanation, no body, no closure. Until Officer Cruz made another discovery while searching through the old case files. Carl Henning had not acted alone. The bracelet's discovery triggered a cascade of revelations. Armed with a search warrant for the pawn shop and Carl Henning's personal records, Officer Cruz and her team began methodically piecing together connections that had eluded investigators for decades. In a hidden compartment of Carl's old desk, they found a key to a storage unit registered under a fictitious name. Inside that unit was a box containing undeveloped rolls of film, a ledger with coded entries, and most significantly, a collection of letters exchanged between Carl and Gregory Weston, the photography teacher who had abruptly left town after Eliza's disappearance. The letters, spanning from 1986 to 1989, revealed a disturbing operation. Weston had been using his position at the school to identify vulnerable students with photographic talent. Under the guise of special projects and internships, he would involve them in what he euphemistically called exclusive photographic opportunities for private collectors. Carl Henning's role was to handle the financial transactions, using his pawn shop to launder the money and occasionally store materials that couldn't be risked in Weston's school darkroom. The undeveloped film, carefully processed by forensic technicians, contained images that confirmed the worst. Weston had been producing inappropriate photographs of minors, including several students who had graduated from Millbrook High over the years. But Eliza was different. The ledger entries suggested she had discovered what was happening and threatened to expose them. An entry dated June 10, 1987, matching the date of her final journal entry, contained a single phrase: "EC problem requires permanent solution." 2 days later, she disappeared. The most shocking revelation came when Officer Cruz tracked down Melanie Winters, now living in Seattle. Initially reluctant to speak, Melanie finally broke her 30-year silence when confronted with the new evidence. "I knew," she admitted, her voice hollow with the weight of long-carried guilt. "Not everything, but enough. Greg, Mr. Weston, had approached me first with the special project. I was flattered, but something felt wrong, so I backed out. Then he turned his attention to Eliza." Melanie revealed that Eliza had confided in her just days before disappearing. Eliza had discovered images of other students while retrieving her portfolio from Weston's office. She'd confronted him, then gone to Carl Henning when she realized he was involved. "She thought she could handle it herself," Melanie said, tears streaming down her face. "She was going to use her grandfather's tracking bracelet as insurance. She told me if anything happened to her, the bracelet would lead people to the truth." But Eliza had underestimated the desperation of men with everything to lose. The night she disappeared, according to Melanie, Weston had offered to meet her to discuss a resolution. Instead, based on the fragmentary evidence now available, investigators believed he had either intentionally or accidentally killed her during that meeting. "I should have told someone," Melanie whispered. "I was just so scared. They knew where I lived. They said no one would believe me over a teacher, and after a while it just seemed too late to matter." But the most crucial question remained unanswered. What had happened to Eliza's body? Neither the letters nor Melanie's testimony provided that answer. The last piece of the puzzle would come from an unexpected source: Jason Henning himself. As investigators expanded their search of the pawnshop property, Jason recalled something his uncle had once told him during a night of heavy drinking years earlier, something he'd dismissed as the ramblings of a guilty conscience. He mentioned the old well behind the shop. Jason told Officer Cruz, said he'd had it filled in back in '87 because it was a safety hazard, but he was crying when he said it. I thought he was just emotional about the old property. Now I wonder if he was trying to confess. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed an anomaly beneath the concrete slab behind the pawnshop. And on May 17, 2017, nearly 30 years after she disappeared, Eliza Chambers was finally found. As investigators prepared to excavate the site behind the pawnshop, media descended on Millbrook. Diana Chambers, now 71, stood vigil behind the police tape, supported by her son Danny, who had flown in from California. After 3 decades of uncertainty, they were finally going to bring Eliza home. But what emerged from beneath the concrete was not what anyone expected. The excavation revealed not a makeshift grave, but a carefully constructed underground room, a bunker approximately 8 feet square with evidence of ventilation systems, an electrical connection tapped from the main building, and most disturbingly, signs of long-term habitation, a cot, shelving, a chemical toilet, and hundreds of tally marks scratched into the wall. Forensic analysis would later confirm the shocking truth. Eliza Chambers had not been killed the night she disappeared. She had been imprisoned beneath the pawnshop for nearly 7 years. The final pages of Carl Henning's coded ledger, overlooked in the initial investigation, contained sporadic entries that now made horrifying sense. Supply lists, medication dosages, and brief behavioral notes ending abruptly in December 1994 with the words, "EC problem finally resolved." Gregory Weston, located in Portland, where he had been living under an assumed name, was arrested and eventually confessed under interrogation. The story he told was even more twisted than investigators had imagined. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Weston insisted. "We just wanted to scare her into silence, but she fought back, threatened to go to the police no matter what. Carl panicked and knocked her unconscious. We thought she was dead. But while transporting what they believed was her body to the abandoned well behind the pawnshop, they discovered she was still breathing. Rather than finishing what they'd started, they made an impulsive decision that would lead to years of calculated cruelty. Carl said we could keep her there until we figured out what to do," Weston continued. "Days turned into weeks. Then it just became the situation. She knew too much. We couldn't let her go, but Carl couldn't bring himself to kill her outright. The bracelet had been removed and placed in the safe immediately, but they had staged the backpack discovery months later to misdirect the investigation toward the theory that Eliza had been taken out of state. For 6 years and 7 months, according to Weston, Eliza had existed in a twilight world beneath the feet of unsuspecting customers, kept alive but barely human. Carl would sedate her when the shop was open, bring her food and water after hours, and use the threat of harming her family to maintain her compliance. The tally marks on the wall stopped at 2,112 days. In the end, it was pneumonia, Weston said flatly. She got sick and Carl refused to get antibiotics, said it was nature solving our problem. I think he was relieved when she died. They had buried her body elsewhere, a location Weston claimed not to know, as Carl had handled that aspect alone. Given Carl's death in 2010, it seemed Eliza's final resting place might remain a mystery, but Weston was lying about one crucial detail. Cell phone records from 1994 placed him in Millbrook the week of Eliza's death, and soil samples from his property in Portland contained microscopic trace evidence consistent with the unique mineral composition of Lake Millbrook's northern shore. On Christmas Eve, 2017, following an extensive search of the area, recovery divers located Eliza's remains weighted down in the deepest part of the lake, finally bringing her home after 30 years of absence. The twist in Eliza's case wasn't just that she had survived for years after her disappearance. It was that during that time, life in Millbrook had continued normally above her head. People had shopped at the pawn shop, greeted Carl Henning on the street, gradually forgotten about the missing girl, all while she scratched another day into the wall of her underground prison. And perhaps most chillingly, her grandfather's gift, the tracking bracelet designed to find her, had been just feet away the entire time, silently waiting for the moment it would fulfill its purpose decades too late. How do we measure the empty spaces left by a missing person? Not just in the obvious absence at the dinner table or the bedroom that remains untouched, but in all the moments that never happened, the graduation, the career, the possible marriage and children, the holidays and birthdays that accumulate year after year, marked only by their incompleteness. For 30 years, Eliza Chambers existed in Millbrook as both a memory and a ghost, sometimes vivid in recollection, sometimes fading like an old photograph, but always defined by her vanishing rather than her living. The town measured time in relation to her, before Eliza disappeared, after Eliza disappeared. Her absence became part of the community's identity, a cautionary tale whispered to teenagers, a tragedy that bound strangers together in collective grief. But the truth about those missing 30 years forces us to confront something far more difficult. For 2,112 of those days, Eliza was not missing at all. She was beneath our feet, close enough to hear footsteps above her head, close enough perhaps to recognize voices. While her case grew cold and her family splintered under the weight of not knowing, while the town gradually returned to normal and her classmates moved on with their lives, Eliza remained frozen in a nightmare of present tense. What does this knowledge do to a community? How do the people of Millbrook reconcile their gradual forgetting with the reality that forgetting was itself a kind of betrayal? How many times had someone stood in Carl Henning's shop, perhaps pawning a guitar or browsing for a used camera, completely unaware that just beneath the floorboards, a girl who had been erased from the world was marking another day on her wall? These are the questions that haunt Millbrook now, questions without satisfactory answers, questions that force us to consider our own capacity for blindness. The ease with which we accept the disappearance of others when searching becomes too painful or inconvenient. Diana Chambers, who spent 3 decades keeping her daughter's memory alive when everyone else was ready to consign Eliza to the past, finds no victory in being proven right about her daughter's fate. The not knowing was unbearable, she told reporters after Eliza's remains were recovered from Lake Millbrook. But this knowing is somehow worse. For Diana, the revelation that Eliza had lived for years after her disappearance, afraid, alone, and so cruelly close to home, transformed decades of hope into a new kind of grief, one tinged with the acid knowledge that while she was preserving her daughter's bedroom like a shrine, Eliza was alive and suffering in darkness. And what of the bracelet that finally revealed the truth? Dr. Howard Chambers did not live to see his invention fulfill its purpose, passing away peacefully in his sleep just weeks after its discovery. But the technology he created, designed with love to protect his granddaughter, ultimately did what no search party, no detective, and no reward offer had managed to do. It spoke for Eliza when she could no longer speak for herself. There is something both miraculous and heartbreaking in this, that an electronic pulse could survive decades of silence, waiting patiently to deliver its message. That a grandfather's gift could transcend his own lifetime to bring his granddaughter justice. That in the end, it wasn't human memory or conscience that revealed the truth, but the persistent beeping of a device that refused to forget its purpose. Perhaps there's a lesson in that persistence, a reminder that no matter how much time passes, truth has its own gravity. It may be delayed, buried, or denied, but eventually it finds its way to the surface. On the 30th anniversary of Eliza's disappearance, June 12, 2017, The people of Millbrook gathered at Lake Millbrook's northern shore for a different kind of memorial than the ones that had marked previous years. This was not a vigil of hope or uncertainty, but a ceremony of remembrance and reckoning. The lakeside park had been renamed Eliza Chambers Memorial Park, with a bronze plaque bearing her photograph, not the faded missing poster image that had become iconic, but a self-portrait she had taken for her photography class, capturing a slight smile and determined eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer. Diana Chambers, supported by her son Danny and his family, stood before the assembled crowd, a mix of longtime residents who remembered Eliza and younger people who had grown up in the shadow of her story. In Diana's hands was a small wooden box containing the silver bracelet that had finally spoken after decades of silence. This bracelet was meant to help find Eliza if she was ever lost, Diana said, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. It couldn't save her, but it refused to let her be forgotten. Today, we're returning it to her. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting the water in shades of copper reminiscent of Eliza's hair, Diana walked to the edge of a small dock and knelt down. She opened the box, removed the bracelet, now silent, its purpose fulfilled, and gently placed it in the water. The silver band caught the light one last time before disappearing beneath the surface, symbolically rejoining Eliza in the place where she had finally been found. The case had brought other forms of closure as well. Gregory Weston was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his role in Eliza's abduction and death. The investigation had uncovered evidence linking him to similar crimes in other states where he had taught before coming to Millbrook, suggesting that Eliza may not have been his first victim, but she was almost certainly his last. Melanie Winters, after providing crucial testimony at Weston's trial, established a foundation in Eliza's name focused on supporting young people who report abuse by authority figures. "I stayed silent for 30 years, she told the courtroom during her testimony. That silence became part of the crime. I don't want any other child to feel they have to carry that burden alone." The Millbrook High School photography program, long dormant after the scandal, was revived with a new darkroom dedicated to Eliza's memory. Each year, a scholarship in her name is awarded to a student who shows promise in the art form she had loved. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Eliza's case was less tangible than plaques or scholarships. It was the way her story changed how the town understood itself, forcing a community that had prided itself on knowing everyone's business to confront the darkness that had existed in plain sight. The revelation that one of their own had been hidden beneath their feet for years shattered the comfortable illusion that evil always happens elsewhere, to other people. Detective Marcus Reynolds, long retired and in failing health, made one final visit to Millbrook when Eliza's remains were recovered. Standing at the lake's edge with Officer Cruz, who had completed the investigation he had begun 3 decades earlier, he reflected on the case that had defined his career. "I always believed we'd find her," he said. "I just never imagined she was so close all along. Makes you wonder what else we're not seeing, right in front of us." As twilight deepened over Lake Millbrook, the gathering began to disperse. Families walked back to their cars. Teenagers drifted toward the town in small groups, and the older residents who remembered Eliza as she had been, vibrant, creative, 17, lingered a moment longer, as if reluctant to close this final chapter. Diana Chambers was the last to leave the shore. As darkness fell completely, she stood looking out over the water, where both her daughter's remains and the bracelet that had revealed the truth now rested. "For 30 years, I kept your room exactly as you left it," she whispered. "I'm going to change it now, not to forget you, but because I finally know where you are." The surface of the lake rippled gently in the evening breeze, catching fragments of moonlight like silver beads, or perhaps like the links of a bracelet, broken apart but still somehow connected, still telling a story that refused to remain buried. In the decades since Eliza vanished, technology has transformed how we search for the missing. GPS tracking, cellular networks, surveillance cameras, all making it harder for people to simply disappear. Yet each year, thousands still vanish, leaving behind families suspended in the same uncertain grief that the Chambers family endured. Eliza's case reminds us that sometimes answers come when we least expect them, in forms we could never predict. That closure, when it finally arrives, may bring as much pain as relief, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of sending signals through time, beeping softly, persistently, until someone finally stops to listen.